My son walked up to the microphone and announced me like I was an exhibit. "This is my mother, the one who tinkers with old radios." The words landed in the chandelier glare and ricocheted through the room. I felt my face heat, the pulse at my throat like a small drum, and the polished wood of the chair pressed into my palms as if it could anchor me there. For a second, the clinking of glasses sharpened into a metallic chorus, and the conversation around table 7 dissolved into a low, judging hum. Nobody laughed out loud at first, just the kind of quiet that means people are choosing a side, amusement or pity. Then someone at the head table laughed, a short bark that set off a ripple. I pictured all the nights I had spent hunched over a workbench, fingers smelling of solder and old lacquer, patching speakers, writing manuals, dreaming of a small business that would finally let me call my craft a career instead of invisible tinkering. What no one in that ballroom knew at the time was that the joke would not end there, and that the next hour would change the trajectory of everything I had tried to make visible. To understand how a moment meant to diminish me turned into a public vindication, I need to go back 4 years to the night I decided to stop shrinking myself to fit other people's comfort. Before I go on, write in the comments where you are watching from and click subscribe if you believe talent is not a hobby. This channel is for people who found their voice late in the script of life. I remember the smell of rosemary from the centerpieces, the way the tablecloth creased like a map, and the heavy hush as the auctioneer, Miguel, cleared his throat and smiled in a way that said he expected applause, not an apology. I grew up in a neighborhood full of small shops and loud radios and learned early that usefulness was tied to being quiet. My father, Thomas, taught me how to take apart a speaker before he taught me how to tie my shoes, handing me tiny screws and saying, "Hold on to the pieces, and you will learn how things go back together." We were poor in the way that makes your hands know the cost of a meal, but rich in a way that taught me to notice the sound a dial made when it found a station. When I married Mark, it was because he wanted a partner who could manage the small emergencies, and he praised me for being steady. I became steady to everyone else and invisible to myself. For 20 years, I did the day job at a post office and the night work fixing radios and making custom speakers for friends at local cafes. I wrote repair notes in a battered notebook, cataloged parts with obsessive tenderness, and dreamed of opening a small workshop called Audible, a place where people who loved sound could find what they needed. The phrase they used most to describe me was hobbyist, and that label lodged like gravel. "It is just a hobby," echoed from coworkers like Linda and from strangers like Carla at the PTA meeting, and even from Daniel, my son, who would later stand at that microphone. Those words shaped the decisions I made: fewer risks, fewer savings for a storefront, less insistence that the time I spent mattered as career. But I kept building prototypes, collecting testimonials in a folder, and, secretly, I started a blog under a pseudonym called Small Wave, where I wrote long posts about the poetry of circuitry and the dignity of sound. It took years before any of those posts caught fire. That slow accumulation of small acts became the backbone of what looked like a hobby but felt like survival. The backstory is not an excuse. It is the map that explains why I let myself be presented as a curiosity that night, and why later I would refuse that smallness in a way that surprised even me. The first attempts to make Audible real were clumsy and quiet and full of sensory detail that later felt like ritual. I remember the first Craigslist post I wrote, fingers sticky with coffee, describing a workshop I wanted to open, the word career not yet on the paper. I took a weekend class in small business basics at the community college where Lena taught accounting and smelled the chalk, the lemon cleaner, and the sun through the high windows. I learned to solder with a tremor in my hand that became steadier in time, the smell of flux a kind of incense to my new life. I set up a tiny website with Pixel Shop and watched analytics tick like a heartbeat. The first customer to trust me with an heirloom radio was Rosa, an elderly neighbor who brought in a wooden console with moth holes and a note inside that read, "For when the music stopped, it felt too big to say." Rosa's gratitude became the first public signal that my work mattered beyond being a pastime. Emails arrived slowly at first, one from a student named Miguel saying he played my restored speaker at a campus open mic and people stayed longer because the sound wrapped the room. A blogger, Elena, wrote a small review noting how my tonal balancing made vinyl feel forgiving. Yet with each tiny win, there were practical failures: suppliers who misdelivered chrome knobs, a bank that rejected my loan application citing unstable income, a landlord who raised rent on an imagined storefront. I learned the technical vocabulary of industry, the weight of invoices, the rhythm of shipments. I learned to photograph my work by lamplight, to write product descriptions that sounded like invitations, and to package speakers with crumpled brown paper and twine so customers would open them with care. Those early steps felt like threading a needle. Then came the rejections and the doubt that nearly shut me down. I pitched Audible to a local maker's market, and the organizer, Sarah, said, "You do lovely work, but people come for trinkets." In one exchange that I replayed until the words bruised, I sat across from a bookstore owner named Victor, who sipped his coffee and said, "Appliances are not what readers shop for." I remember the smell of burnt espresso and the metallic tang of the shop's industrial heater as he gestured with a paper cup and then folded his hands as if tucking me away into a drawer labeled "friendly eccentricity." Dialogue mounted like a wall. "You should stick to restoring vintage stuff," said Mark when I mentioned a small grant. "It is safer to keep this as something you do at night." Daniel, who was 20 then, flung a shirt across the couch and said, "Mom, people will never take you seriously if you call it a career." That night, I lay awake and felt the quiet zip of fluorescent light through the blinds, counting how many doors had closed. The rejections multiplied beyond businesses: a supplier's curt email, a magazine that replied with a form letter, a festival application that never received a reply. I began to doubt whether persistence was vanity. Still, the replies from customers like Rosa and Miguel held me together a little. In a conversation expanded over weeks, I argued with myself and with friends. "Why do you keep at this?" asked Elena over the phone as rain tapped the window. "Because when I turn a dial and hear it sing, I remember who I was before the world told me to sit down," I answered. The doubts were thick like coffee grounds, but small gratitudes kept floating to the surface. Then the first real signs of audience arrived, and with them a fragile community who refused to see me as invisible. I began to receive messages that read like lifelines. "Your speaker saved our movie night," wrote Thomas, a teacher in Asheville, and attached a photo of kids leaning into sound. "You give the living room a voice," wrote Linda from the craft fair, where she had bought a sample in a tent with string lights. I started seeing repeat orders and people recommending my work on neighborhood groups. The first online review that made me cry was by a woman named Priya, who wrote, "She tuned my father back into the world." I printed that review and pinned it above my workbench. The growth felt slow but tangible. A university radio station named KALP invited me to a live segment after someone named Carla, a listener, sent an enthusiastic email. "We love your perspective," the producer said. "Would you come in?" On air, I described how a balanced mid-range could make an old crooner sound intimate. A listener named Mark texted a link, and suddenly a stranger highlighted my work in a community newsletter. My mailing list increased from 12 to 100 in a month, and with it came inquiries from people I had never met. The community named people who mattered to me: Rosa, who kept bringing tea; Miguel, the auctioneer who used my speaker at a local event last winter; Lena, who helped me with budgets; Elena, who edited my blog posts; and Victor, who later offered shelf space after seeing the demand. Small validations accumulated into a ledger of proof that my craft mattered to a diverse group of people. Opportunity arrived in the form of a phone call that sounded impossible. Carla, who I later learned was an agent for creative makers, called from a number I did not recognize and said plainly, "I have seen your work and I want to talk about scaling an idea." Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who brokered futures, and the conversation contained an offer that made me sit down where I stood. "We can get you an extended residency, retail placement, and a short documentary," she said. The words felt like a draft opening a window. I asked about terms, and she listed possibilities in a tone that married care with spreadsheets. "We would want exclusivity for a limited window," she explained. "You would get product development funds and a team to help with distribution." In the same week, a boutique in the city reached out to propose a pop-up. "We love what you do," said a buyer named Alicia in an email. "Our shoppers are asking for meaningful craft." The stakes shifted, and with them came a fear of losing the thing that had kept my work honest. I negotiated, asked questions I had been too shy to voice before, and named boundaries. "This is not a hobby," I said into the receiver as the street noise hummed in my ear. "This is my career." Carla's laugh on the other end sounded relieved. "Good," she said, "because that is how we will treat it." The conversation moved me from a private dream into the public opportunities that changed trajectories. Preparation for the gala event where I would be presented as a local success was intimate and exhausting. My son Daniel asked me to help with a charity auction he was producing for a tech incubator fundraising dinner, and I agreed because family mattered and because I thought the exposure could be gentle and useful. In the days leading up to event, I packed a small speaker as a demonstration piece and practiced a short explanation, smoothing my hands over the fabric while the lamp warmed my knuckles. The house smelled of lemon oil and motor oil as I polished metal faces. The tactile feel of brass scrubbed under running water was oddly meditative. I took the coat to the dry cleaner and heard the faint hiss of steam in the back room. Daniel called in a panic about seating. "Charts," and I listened while soldering a connection. "Mom, can you just be there at 7 and smile when they ask about you?" he asked. "I will be there," I said, and the word felt too small and too big at once. Rosa dropped by with a baker's box of cookies and hugged me with flour on her sleeves. "You are not invisible to me," she whispered, and the smell of sugar stayed on my clothing. The night of the gala, the ballroom smelled of perfume and polished wood, with a low electric buzz from the lighting rigs. Miguel, the auctioneer, looked suave in a tuxedo and tapped the microphone in a way that made a metallic spark of sound appear like a promise. I had rehearsed a short line for when my name would be read, the line that would present me as a maker, not as a curiosity. Daniel had other plans. The humbling moment arrived with precision and a sense of malice I could not initially name. Daniel stepped up to the microphone in front of 200 people, and with a grin that looked practiced, he said, "This is my mother. She likes to tinker with old radios. Put your hands together for the hobbyist." Laughter fluttered like confetti and landed on me. The room felt made of glass, and I imagined it shattering. I remember the prickle at the base of my skull and the way the chair felt cold beneath the fabric of my dress. "Mom just makes things at home," he added, turning to the audience as if explaining a party trick. The auctioneer, Miguel, moved on to the next item. I sat still, tasting a metallic aftertaste of humiliation. Then a voice from the back cut through the ripple. "How much to have her speak at my store?" someone called. The voice belonged to a man in a sharp suit. A murmur passed through the crowd. Was he serious or mocking? The man raised his hand and called, $1 to start the bid on her time, and the room responded with the burst of cruel laughter Daniel expected. The auctioneer called, $1, going once, and the smell of spilled wine and candle smoke seemed to tighten around us. That first moment of public shaming was a tectonic move meant to reduce me to a joke, and for a breath I felt the world agree with him. The twist came in an unexpected exchange that turned the room and the narrative. As the crowd waited for a punchline, a deep voice said, "I'll bid $1 million to get her to come to my events." And all at once, a breeze traveled across the ballroom like someone opening a window. The voice belonged to a man later introduced as Alexander Whitman, a philanthropist with a cartel of hotels and a fondness for human stories, accompanied by a woman named Elena who smiled like someone who kept quiet power in her handbag. The auctioneer stopped and looked at him, startled, and then, for the first time, the room shifted from laughter to startled curiosity. "Are you serious?" someone called from the balcony. "Yes," Alexander said. "I have a chain of venues that could showcase people who rediscover their work. If she says yes, I will back a program to get her into a residency and fund a small documentary." The way he said residency made my chest expand, and a shiver of disbelief moved through me. In that exchange, the energy in the room reversed. People who had laughed suddenly leaned forward to listen, as if the existence of someone willing to pay that price rewired the social calculation of worth. Miguel, the auctioneer, whose smile had been sharp, blinked and then cleared his throat. "Going once for $1 million, he announced slowly, as if testing if the word could really be said aloud. The sound in the room became a held breath. Daniel looked as if someone had removed the floor beneath his feet. For a second, I saw him the way I used to see him at 5 years old, before he learned the cruel economy of public performance. "Who are you?" I asked out loud, because my throat would not let me stay silent. Alexander stepped down from his seat and walked forward. "My name is Alexander Whitman," he said. "I listen for voices that are being smothered, and I give them room." That scene contained a concentration of sensory details that I can still replay like film. The chandeliers refracted the light into lines across Alexander's jacket. The scent of his cologne entered my nostrils as a clean contrast to the perfume and old wood. Miguel's gavel clicked, a sound that until then had been an instrument of spectacle, but that night became a hinge. People murmured names: Alicia from the boutique, Priya the reviewer, Victor the bookstore owner, who had once shrugged at me and who now, mid-room, whispered to his neighbor, "She deserves it." The dialogue in the room expanded in fast, breathless exchanges. "Is this for real?" asked Rosa, leaning forward. "He means it," said Elena. "He pays artists to be seen," whispered Thomas, my father, who had come to support me quietly. That public reversal strummed across the crowd and changed the axis of the evening. When Alexander's check arrived, the applause that followed was not the mocking kind. It carried weight, like an audience finally learning how to clap with clarity. In the moment that the campaign to get me speaking and showcasing formed, the humiliation evaporated and was replaced by an astonishment that felt like vindication. The room reassembled itself around a new story, from invisible to indispensable. People I had known who had dismissed me now approached with different eyes. Daniel, who had staged the initial humiliation, found himself surrounded by faces that no longer found his joke funny. The social currency had shifted. The confrontation that followed with Daniel was intimate, sharp, and necessary. Later that night, after the gala lights dimmed and the staff cleared away the last of the centerpieces, we had a conversation that was equal parts confession and demand. "Why did you do that?" I asked, my voice raw and carrying the echo of the ballroom. He stood with his hands in his pockets, the blazer he had borrowed from a friend smelling faintly of cigar smoke. "I thought it would be funny," he said. "I wanted people to notice my production, not make it about you." "Did you think I would laugh with you?" I said, the labored quiet of years pressing between my sentences. "No," he admitted, and the honesty landed like a small, bright stone. "I was embarrassed, Mom. I thought it would give me control. I did not realize it would humiliate you." We went back and forth in a dialogue that lasted long into the night. "You made a spectacle of me," I said. "I know," he replied, and I am sorry." He cried then, which was a thing I had not expected. "I see you differently now," he added. "I thought calling it a hobby would keep things light. I did not see the harm." The conversation included apologies and boundaries. I said, "If we are to move forward, there must be rules about how you present me in public," and he agreed, promising to consult me about any future introductions. The scene was full of details: the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the way the light from the street lamp pulled on the linoleum, the stale smell of the coat he left on the chair. It was not a tidy repair, but a start. 3 moments of tension defined the arc of what came next, and each demanded attention. The first was the legal negotiation with Carla in the boutique that almost derailed everything. We sat across from Alicia and her lawyer at a small table, papers fanned out like fall leaves. I could feel the ink on the contracts like heat against my palms. "Exclusive for 6 months, the lawyer said, and the words felt like a trap. For 3 paragraphs, we debated terms, and I insisted on the right to continue personal restorations. The tension was a tightrope walk between protection and opportunity. The second moment was public and immediate. A journalist named Mark wrote a piece that misrepresented my early work as retro gimmickry, and his words circulated on social platforms. My inbox filled with comments that split between praise and thin cruelty. The sensation of thousands of eyes judging the thing that I had counted on for identity made my stomach hollow. I replied with measured dignity and called one interview where I spoke about lineage and craft. The third tension was visceral and personal. Daniel received messages attacking him for his joke, and in retaliation he lashed out at me in private. We had a heated exchange at the kitchen table, with rain tapping the window, voices raised, and then small silence puncturing like glass. Each tension moment lasted long enough to leave a bruise, but the process of resolving each required naming values and stating limits. In every instance, I insisted on language that reclaimed dignity. "This is not a hobby," I told the lawyer, to reporters, and to my son. Saying it aloud became a small ritual. The public validation that followed felt like an increase in volume that I had not expected. Alexander arranged a short residency at his Whitman house for local makers. They filmed 3 short segments about my work and called it Small Wave Sessions. Orders came in for custom pieces with notes like, "For my father who loves old records," and "For my living room, please make it warm." Sales tripled over the next 2 months, and my mailing list grew into a community that exchanged stories along with orders. People I had named in the early chapters reappeared in the new economy of attention. Rosa sold out of jam at a craft fair and left a note saying, "Your speaker filled our tent with people." Priya sent a long message about how my piece made her mother cry for joy the first week it played. Lena joined me to teach a small business workshop in the residency space, and Miguel agreed to auction items in a way that honored makers. Carla negotiated a modest contract with a documentary channel that promised a short film about second acts. The boutique where Alicia worked asked to carry a small collection, and Victor set aside a shelf with a handwritten sign that read, "Local Sound Mender." Those small recognitions stacked into measurable outcomes: a steady increase in orders, a modest grant for studio space, and invitations to speak at local colleges. The narrative shifted in the community's eyes, and the online comments changed tone from mockery to curiosity and then to admiration. The months afterward were full of rebuilding relationships and building boundaries. I had conversations with Daniel that were honest and often painful. "I understand why you were embarrassed," he admitted in one of our many talks. "I failed to see that making light of your work was harm." We negotiated new terms for how he would introduce me at public events. "If you want to support me, ask before you present me," I said one evening when the sky was violet and the air smelled of cut grass. "And do not use me for applause." He agreed, and he began to attend workshops and help with logistics in a different spirit. We also set professional boundaries with Carla in the boutique, spelling out what I would retain creative control over and what rights I would license. The Whitman residency produced a short film that aired on a local channel and then circulated online, picking up viewers and a few kind reviews. Alexander stayed in touch, and he introduced me to a network of curators who invited me. The key is to add kidney beans or black beans. That's a great source of protein, and they have a really good texture that works well in chili. 1 month after the gala, I had settled into the residency with a schedule that included restoring radios in the morning and teaching a midday class where people pressed their palms to speaker cones and learned the intimacy of balanced sound. The space smelled of wood shavings and coffee. My phone buzzed with orders and occasionally messages that said, "We saw you on the film." I balanced teaching and production and found the days filled with a new kind of exhaustion that felt generous. 3 months in, the bookings had stabilized, and the documentary had led to a modest stream of invitations to speak at stores and community centers. The revenue allowed me to hire an assistant named Miguelina, who helped package orders and run social updates. We organized a small show at Victor's bookstore that sold out and raised funds for a community radio project. Daniel and I attended together, and he introduced me properly, eyes honest and hands steady. At 6 months, the business had real traction. Alicia expanded the boutique placement to 2 more stores, and Alexander connected me with a small foundation that offered a grant for makers over 50. I moved into a studio with more light and bought a proper soldering station. The epilogue is measured not only by invoices, but by a deeper accounting. Reconciling with Daniel, renegotiating what family support looked like, and asserting that my time mattered. I set firm boundaries. No more surprise presentations, consultation before any public mention, and clear credit on every collaboration. The community grew with names I now knew well. Rosa, who sent pies to show appreciation. Priya, who organized a small reading. Elena, who introduced me to film contacts. Victor, who kept shelf space. Daniel, who learned to applaud without pretense. Alicia, who shifted from buyer to advocate. And Carla, who continued as an agent with explicit respect for my creative control. In the quiet aftermath, I found that reclaiming visibility did not mean erasing the long years of being unseen. It meant naming them and bringing them along as proof. I still work at a bench, fingers knowing the language of wires, and I teach Sunday classes where students bring family radios with notes inside. My work is now a livelihood with contracts and invoices, but it is also a public practice with a responsibility to the people who trusted me early. I wrote a short manual called A Voice Restored that gathered repair notes and stories, and within 3 months of the residency, it sold enough copies to pay the studio lease for another half year. The documentary led to a small speaking circuit and a partnership with a community radio project in the city. My relationship with Daniel is ongoing work. We meet weekly to talk about boundaries and respect, and I see him practicing humility in ways that make me proud. If there is a lesson I want you to take away, it is this. Being called a hobby by people who cannot hear you does not make your work worthless. Saying out loud that your labor is a career is radical and necessary. If this story has touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that talent can be late and that public humiliation can sometimes, through strange turns, become public vindication. Subscribe for more stories of people who reclaimed their voices, and leave a comment telling us a time you were underestimated and how you answered. For me, choosing myself changed the script. I chose not to be invisible anymore, and that choice made all the difference.